The room was silent except for the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor and the faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Mia lay on the hospital bed, her breathing labored, her hands trembling as they clutched the thin sheet draped over her. This was supposed to be a joyous moment, the culmination of months of waiting and preparation. But instead of feeling the warmth of celebration, she felt a suffocating chill creeping up her spine. Her husband wasn't there. An emergency work call had pulled him away at the last moment. The nurses had assured her she wasn't alone, that they'd be back to check on her soon. But as the minutes stretched into an eternity, Mia couldn't shake the growing sense that she wasn't as alone as they claimed. And then, just as she began to drift into uneasy sleep, she heard it, a faint whisper so soft it could have been the wind. But there was no breeze in the delivery room, and the voice carried an unsettling weight that sent shivers racing across her skin. Mia's eyes snapped open, her heart pounding in her chest. She stared at the ceiling, listening intently, her breath catching as the whisper came again, clearer this time. It was faint, almost like someone standing just outside the room murmuring words she couldn't quite make out. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice wavering as she struggled to sound braver than she felt. The room remained silent. The monitor continued its steady rhythm, and the hallway outside seemed unnervingly still. Mia's eyes darted toward the door, which was slightly ajar, allowing a sliver of dim light to spill into the room. Her rational mind tried to soothe her fears. Perhaps it was one of the nurses in the hallway, their voice accidentally carrying through the thin walls. But deep down, she knew that wasn't it. The sound hadn't come from the hallway. It had come from inside the room. The whispering started again, this time closer, as though someone were standing near the foot of her bed. The words were still indiscernible, but there was an urgency to them now, a pleading tone that made Mia's stomach churn. Panic began to claw its way into her chest. She reached for the call button clipped to her bed, pressing it repeatedly. Her fingers trembled as she waited for someone to respond, her eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. A nurse's voice crackled through the intercom. "Yes, Mia? Are you all right?" There's someone in here," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. I heard someone whispering." The nurse's tone remained calm, but there was a hint of concern. "We'll send someone to check on you right away. Just stay calm." The line went dead, leaving Mia alone once more. She clutched her belly protectively, her mind racing. She tried to tell herself it was just her nerves. She was exhausted, overwhelmed, and in pain. It was easy to imagine things in a state like this, but as she stared into the dim corners of the room, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't imagining it. A shadow shifted near the sink. Mia's breath hitched as she fixed her gaze on the spot, her heart pounding so loudly it drowned out the monitor's beeping. The shadow didn't move again, but the air in the room felt heavier, colder. The whisper returned, louder now. This time, Mia could almost make out the words. It sounded like a woman's voice, low and strained, as if speaking through clenched teeth. Don't let them what?" Mia blurted out, her voice trembling. The whisper stopped abruptly, leaving the room in an oppressive silence. Mia's chest heaved as she tried to catch her breath, her eyes darting frantically around the room. The door creaked open, and Mia nearly screamed, but it was only a nurse stepping inside. A kind-looking woman with tired eyes and a clipboard in hand. She smiled reassuringly. "Mia, are you all right?" the nurse asked, approaching the bed. "There was someone here," Mia said quickly. "I heard them." A woman's voice. She was whispering something. The nurse's smile faltered slightly, but she quickly masked her hesitation. "The staff is limited tonight, so it's unlikely anyone else is in this wing. Maybe you overheard something from another room." "No," Mia insisted, her voice shaking. "It was here in this room." The nurse glanced around, her expression softening with sympathy. "You've been through a lot tonight. Sometimes stress can play tricks on us. But I'll stay here with you for a bit, all right? Just to make sure you're comfortable." Mia nodded reluctantly, her hands still clutching the sheet. She wanted to believe the nurse, to accept that it was all in her head. But the unease gnawing at her wouldn't fade. As the nurse busied herself checking Mia's vitals, the whispers began again. This time, Mia wasn't the only one who heard them. The nurse froze, her hand hovering over the blood pressure cuff. Her eyes darted toward the corner of the room, her expression tightening. "Did you hear that?" Mia whispered, her voice barely audible. The nurse didn't respond immediately. She set the cuff down slowly, her movements deliberate. "It's probably just the air vents," she said, though her tone was far less confident than before. But Mia knew better. The nurse had heard it too. Suddenly, the overhead lights flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced along the walls. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, and now Mia could make out the words. "Protect the child. Don't let them take her." The nurse backed away, her face pale as she muttered something under her breath. "I'll get the doctor," she said hurriedly, her voice tight with fear. Before Mia could respond, the nurse was gone, the door swinging shut behind her. The room was silent once more, but the oppressive weight in the air remained. Mia clutched her stomach, her instincts screaming at her that something was horribly wrong. She wasn't just imagining things. The whispers weren't in her head. They were real. The air in the delivery room had grown impossibly still, as if time itself were holding its breath. Mia's grip on the bed rail was so tight her knuckles turned white. She kept glancing at the door, praying the nurse would return with help. But deep down, she knew no one could protect her from whatever was lurking here. The whispers had stopped for the moment, but the silence was worse. It wasn't the absence of sound. It was the heavy, expectant hush of something waiting in the darkness. And then the lights flickered again. Mia froze, her breath caught in her throat as the room plunged into brief darkness. When the lights returned, they were dimmer, their flickering more erratic. Shadows danced across the walls, warping and twisting unnaturally, as though alive. She clutched her swollen belly protectively, her heart pounding as the whispers began anew, louder and clearer than before. "They're coming? Don't let them in." Mia's skin prickled as the voice, soft yet urgent, seemed to echo from every corner of the room. It wasn't just one voice now. There were several, overlapping and weaving together in an eerie, dissonant chorus. Before she could react, the temperature in the room plummeted. Her breath came out in visible puffs, and the monitors began to glitch, their beeps distorted and irregular. The shadows near the far wall grew darker, coalescing into an inky mass that seemed to writhe and pulse. Panic surged through her as she pressed the call button again, this time holding it down for dear life. But no one answered. The intercom remained silent. The door to the delivery room creaked open slowly, and Mia's heart leapt into her throat. Relief washed over her as she saw the nurse return, but it was short-lived. The nurse's face was pale, her eyes wide with fear, and her hands trembled as she clutched the doorframe. "Mia," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You need to come with me. Now." "What's going on?" Mia asked, her voice shaking as she struggled to sit up. "There's no time to explain," the nurse said, her gaze darting nervously around the room. "You're not safe here." The shadows on the far wall surged forward, and the nurse gasped, backing away. Mia's eyes widened as the inky mass seemed to take shape, forming vague, humanoid figures with glowing, hollow eyes. The whispers grew deafening, their words now a chaotic jumble that made Mia's head throb. The nurse grabbed Mia's arm, pulling her off the bed. "We have to go," she shouted, her voice rising above the cacophony. Mia winced in pain as she slid off the bed, her swollen belly making it difficult to move quickly. The nurse wrapped an arm around her, practically dragging her toward the door. Behind them, the shadowy figures began to advance, their movements jerky and unnatural. The hallway outside the delivery room was eerily empty. The fluorescent lights flickered violently, casting distorted shadows that seemed to stretch and crawl along the walls. The nurse led Mia down the corridor, her grip firm but trembling. "Where is everyone?" Mia asked, her voice laced with desperation. "They're gone," the nurse replied, her tone grim. "Something's happening, something this hospital wasn't prepared for." As they rounded a corner, a low, guttural growl echoed from behind them. Mia glanced back, her blood turning to ice as she saw one of the shadowy figures emerging from the doorway they had just left. It moved with an unnatural fluidity, its glowing eyes locked onto her. The nurse pulled her forward, quickening their pace despite Mia's protests. "We need to get to the stairwell," she said. "It's the only way out." The growling grew louder, and Mia could hear the sound of the creature's footsteps, if they could even be called that, echoing off the walls. Her chest tightened with fear as she clutched her belly, willing her baby to stay safe. They reached the stairwell, the nurse pushing the heavy door open with a grunt. The cold, metallic scent of the stairwell hit Mia's nostrils as they stepped inside. The nurse slammed the door shut behind them, locking it with trembling hands. "Will that hold them?" Mia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The nurse shook her head, her expression grim. "I don't know." As they descended the stairs, the air grew colder, and the whispers followed them, now faint but persistent. Mia's heart raced as she struggled to keep up, her legs trembling with each step. "What are those things?" Mia asked, her voice breaking. The nurse hesitated, glancing over her shoulder before answering. "I don't know what they are," she admitted, "but they're not supposed to be here. And they want something, someone." Mia's stomach churned as she realized what the nurse meant. "My baby," she said, her voice trembling. The nurse nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. "We can't let them have her. Whatever they are, they're tied to this hospital, and they're drawn to you." Mia's mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. Why her? Why her baby? As they reached the bottom of the stairwell, the whispers suddenly stopped. The oppressive silence returned, heavy and suffocating. The nurse hesitated, her hand on the door leading to the ground floor. "What's wrong?" Mia asked, her voice hushed. The nurse shook her head, her expression wary. "Something's not right." She pushed the door open slowly, peering into the hallway beyond. The lights were dim, and the corridor was shrouded in an eerie half-darkness. The air felt thick, like wading through a dense fog. They stepped into the hallway cautiously, the nurse leading the way. Mia's heart pounded as she clung to the nurse's arm, her eyes darting around nervously. And then they heard it, a soft, chilling laugh that echoed from somewhere ahead. The nurse froze, her grip on Mia tightening. "Stay behind me," she whispered. The laugh grew louder, and Mia's breath hitched as a figure emerged from the shadows. It wasn't one of the shadowy creatures. It was a man. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken and hollow, and his smile stretched unnaturally wide. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice dripping with malice. Mia took a step back, her heart racing as the man's gaze locked onto her. The nurse stepped in front of her protectively, her hands clenched into fists. "Leave us alone," the nurse said firmly, though her voice trembled. The man chuckled, his head tilting to the side unnaturally. "Oh, it's not me you should be afraid of," he said, his smile widening. "It's what's coming." Before they could react, the whispers returned, louder and more chaotic than ever. The lights flickered violently, and the man dissolved into the shadows, his laughter echoing in their ears. Mia's knees buckled, and she clung to the nurse for support. The hallway around them began to distort, the walls seeming to close in. The shadows surged forward, and the whispers became deafening. The nurse grabbed Mia's hand, pulling her forward. "Run," she shouted. Mia's breath came in ragged gasps as she stumbled down the hallway, her legs barely keeping up with the nurse's frantic pace. Behind them, the shadows writhed and surged, the whispers crescendoing into a cacophony of desperate warnings and sinister laughter. She didn't know how much longer she could run, her body aching and heavy with the weight of her pregnancy. But she had no choice. The darkness was closing in, and the only way forward was through the unknown. The nurse suddenly yanked Mia to the left, pulling her into a narrow side corridor. The air was colder here, stale and oppressive, and the fluorescent lights flickered weakly, casting long, distorted shadows on the walls. "This way," the nurse hissed, her voice low and urgent. "We're heading to the old ward. They won't follow us there." Mia wanted to ask why, but her throat was too dry, her voice lost in the chaos. She followed the nurse blindly, her heart pounding as the whispers behind them grew fainter. though the cold seemed to seep deeper into her bones with every step. The hallway stretched on endlessly, its peeling wallpaper and broken tiles giving way to an older, more decrepit part of the hospital. The lights here were almost non-existent, and the air smelled of mildew and something metallic, like rust or blood. The nurse stopped abruptly in front of a heavy metal door, its surface covered in scratches and faded warnings scrawled in red paint. She fumbled with a set of keys, her hands trembling as she unlocked it. "In here," she said, pushing the door open. Mia hesitated, staring into the darkness beyond. "What is this place?" "The old maternity ward," the nurse replied, her voice tight. "It was shut down years ago, but it's the only safe place left." Safe wasn't the word Mia would have used. The room beyond was cold and uninviting, its walls lined with rusted medical equipment and faded posters of smiling mothers holding their newborns. A single gurney sat in the center of the room, its surface covered in a thin layer of dust. The nurse closed the door behind them, locking it with a heavy click. She turned to Mia, her face pale and drawn. "They won't come here," she said, as though trying to reassure herself as much as Mia. "Why not?" Mia asked, her voice shaking. The nurse hesitated, her gaze darting toward the shadows lingering just beyond the frosted glass of the door. "This place, it's different. Whatever they are, they avoid it." Mia sank onto the edge of the gurney, her body trembling with exhaustion. Her mind raced with questions, but the nurse's tense demeanor silenced her for the moment. The whispers had stopped entirely, leaving an eerie silence that pressed down on Mia like a physical weight. She glanced around the room, her eyes catching on an old, faded photograph pinned to the wall. It showed a group of nurses standing in front of the maternity ward, their faces solemn. One of the nurses looked eerily familiar. Mia's breath hitched as she realized it was the woman who had been helping her, the same nurse standing across the room, staring out the small window in the door. "You're in the picture," Mia said, her voice barely above a whisper. The nurse stiffened, her back still to Mia. "That was a long time ago," she said quietly. "But how?" Mia began, but the nurse cut her off. "There's no time for that now," she said, her tone sharp. "We need to figure out how to keep you and the baby safe." Mia's mind reeled. Something wasn't right. Something about this nurse, this ward, this entire situation felt impossibly wrong. But before she could press further, the whispers returned. This time they were different, softer, closer. Mia's eyes darted around the room, but there was no sign of movement. The nurse tensed, her gaze locked on the door as the whispers grew louder. "They shouldn't be able to come here," she muttered, her voice trembling. The door rattled violently, the frosted glass cracking as something slammed against it from the other side. Mia scrambled off the gurney, her heart pounding as the room seemed to darken around them. "They're here," the nurse said, her voice barely audible. The door burst open, and the shadows poured in like a flood, their inky tendrils writhing and twisting as they filled the room. The whispers grew deafening, their chaotic voices overlapping in a maddening cacophony. Mia backed away, clutching her belly as the shadows swirled around her. The nurse stepped forward, her expression resolute. "Stay behind me," she said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. The shadows surged toward them, and the nurse raised her hands, a blinding light erupting from her palms. The shadows recoiled, their forms dissolving into the walls as the light filled the room. Mia stared in shock as the nurse turned to her, her face glowing with an ethereal light. "You need to go," the nurse said urgently. "There's a hidden passage in the back. It'll lead you out of here." "What about you?" Mia asked, her voice trembling. The nurse shook her head. "This is where I belong, but you have to protect your child. She's the key to ending this." Before Mia could respond, the nurse pushed her toward a hidden door in the corner of the room. Mia hesitated for a moment, her heart heavy with fear and uncertainty, but the nurse's pleading gaze spurred her forward. She opened the door, revealing a narrow, dimly lit corridor that seemed to stretch on forever. As she stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind her, cutting off the light and the whispers. Mia took a deep breath, her heart pounding as she began to move forward. The air in the corridor was cold and heavy, but it was silent, blissfully silent. For now. Conclusion. As Mia walked deeper into the passage, the weight of everything that had happened pressed down on her. The nurse's sacrifice, the whispers, the shadows, they all pointed to a greater mystery, one that seemed tied to her unborn child. But she couldn't stop now. The only way out was forward, and she was determined to protect her baby at all costs. Mia's footsteps echoed down the narrow passageway, her heart pounding in her chest as the oppressive silence pressed against her ears. The cold air carried a faint metallic scent, and the dim light overhead flickered weakly, casting distorted shadows that seemed to twist and reach for her. The nurse's words replayed in her mind. She's the key to ending this. What did it mean? What could her unborn child possibly have to do with the horrors that stalked her through the hospital? The passage seemed endless, stretching into the shadows like a corridor of nightmares. But Mia had no choice. She had to keep going for her baby, for herself, and for answers. The narrow corridor finally opened into a small, circular room. The walls were lined with old, rusted filing cabinets, and a single, ancient light bulb hung from the ceiling, swaying slightly as though disturbed by an unseen breeze. In the center of the room stood a large, oak desk covered in papers, photographs, and medical charts yellowed with age. A single name was scrawled across the top of each file in faded ink: Project Genesis. Mia hesitated, her hand trembling as she reached for one of the folders. The paper felt brittle under her fingers as she opened it, her eyes scanning the neatly typed text. The document detailed an experimental program conducted in the hospital decades ago. It spoke of genetic enhancement and creating a new generation of humanity. Subjects were chosen from pregnant women admitted to the hospital, their unborn children experimented on without consent. Mia's stomach churned as she read further. The experiments had been deemed a failure after strange, unexplainable phenomena began occurring. Patients reported seeing shadowy figures and hearing whispers, and many of the children born during the experiments disappeared without a trace. Her hands shook as she flipped through the pages, landing on a photograph clipped to the back of the file. It showed a group of doctors and nurses standing proudly in front of a newborn nursery. Among them was the nurse who had helped her escape. Mia's breath hitched as realization dawned. She was part of this. The light bulb overhead flickered violently, and the whispers returned, faint but growing louder. Mia's head snapped up, her heart pounding as she stuffed the file in her pocket and backed away from the desk. The air grew colder, and the shadows on the walls seemed to deepen, writhing like living creatures. A low, guttural growl echoed through the room, and Mia's body froze with fear. From the far corner, a figure emerged, one of the shadowy creatures that had chased her before. Its hollow, glowing eyes locked onto her, and it began to move forward, its steps slow and deliberate. Mia stumbled back, her hands searching blindly for something, anything she could use to defend herself. Her fingers closed around a heavy metal rod leaning against the wall, and she gripped it tightly, her knuckles white. The creature lunged, and Mia swung the rod with all her strength. It passed through the shadowy figure as though it were smoke, but the creature recoiled, its form flickering and distorting. The whispers grew louder, filling her head with a cacophony of voices that seemed to claw at her mind. She pressed her free hand to her temple, squeezing her eyes shut as she stumbled toward the door on the other side of the room. The whispers changed, becoming clearer. One voice rose above the rest, a woman's voice, calm and soothing. "Mia, you must keep going. The answers are ahead." Mia's eyes snapped open, and she turned toward the door. The shadowy creature lunged again, but this time she didn't hesitate. She sprinted forward, her body fueled by adrenaline, and slammed into the door, bursting into another corridor. The door slammed shut behind her, and the whispers abruptly stopped. The silence was deafening, but Mia didn't slow down. She clutched her belly, her heart racing as she stumbled down the corridor. This one was different. The walls were made of rough stone, and the air was damp and heavy. The faint sound of dripping water echoed around her, and the floor sloped downward, leading her deeper into the earth. She didn't know where she was going, but she felt an inexplicable pull, as though something or someone was guiding her. The corridor ended in a large, open chamber. The room was illuminated by a faint, unnatural light that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. In the center of the chamber was a strange, circular altar, its surface etched with intricate symbols that pulsed faintly with a pale blue glow. Mia approached the altar cautiously, her heart pounding. As she drew closer, the air grew warmer, and a strange sense of calm washed over her. On the altar lay a small, leather-bound journal. She hesitated for a moment before picking it up, the leather soft and warm against her fingers. She opened the journal, her eyes scanning the handwritten text. It was a diary, written by one of the doctors who had overseen Project Genesis. The entries detailed the experiments, the failures, and the consequences. The shadows, the whispers, they weren't just hallucinations or side effects. They were real. The experiments had torn a hole between this world and another, allowing something dark and malevolent to seep through. The final entry sent a chill down Mia's spine. The key lies within the children. Their blood can either seal the breach or open it fully. One will come who will decide the fate of both worlds. We must protect her at all costs. Mia's hand instinctively moved to her belly as tears welled in her eyes. It's her, she thought. My baby. Before she could process the revelation, a low, rumbling growl echoed through the chamber. She turned slowly, her blood running cold as she saw the shadowy creatures gathering at the edges of the room, their glowing eyes fixed on her. The whispers returned, louder and more chaotic than ever, and the shadows began to move forward, surrounding her. Mia clutched the journal to her chest, her mind racing. She didn't know how to stop them, but she knew she had to try. As the shadows closed in, Mia's resolve hardened. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for her baby, for the world, and for a chance at a future free from the darkness. She had the key. Now she just had to figure out how to use it. Mia stood frozen at the center of the glowing chamber, the weight of the journal pressed against her chest. The whispers rose to a deafening roar as the shadowy figures encircled her, their glowing eyes pulsing like embers in the dark. She wasn't sure if it was the baby's heartbeat she felt or her own, but it was steady, defiant. Despite the terror swirling around her, something deep within her refused to back down. This wasn't just about her survival anymore. It was about protecting her child and stopping the nightmare from spreading. The shadows hesitated, their movements faltering as the symbols on the altar flared brighter. Whatever power lay here, it was ancient and potent, and it was waiting for her. Mia placed the journal on the altar, her trembling fingers brushing against the etched symbols. As her touch connected with the glowing lines, a wave of warmth surged through her, replacing the cold fear that had gripped her moments ago. The whispers shifted, transforming into a single voice, clear, calm, and familiar. Mia, you are stronger than you know. It was the nurse's voice, resonating in her mind like a lifeline in the chaos. Mia took a deep breath, her eyes locking onto the advancing shadows. What do you want from me? She demanded, her voice trembling but steady. The creatures didn't respond, but the whispers grew louder, pressing against her mind like a storm. Images flashed before her eyes, visions of the experiments, the children born in the hospital, and the breach between worlds. And then she saw her baby. The vision was brief but clear, a small, crying infant cradled in her arms, surrounded by light. The shadows recoiled from the child's presence, their forms dissolving into mist. The nurse's voice echoed again. Her blood is the key, but the choice is yours. Mia's breath hitched as the realization dawned. The shadows weren't just trying to destroy her. They were trying to claim her child, to use her as a conduit to fully open the breach and let their world consume hers. But the journal had said the child could also seal the breach, closing it forever. Mia's hand moved instinctively to her belly, her resolve hardening. She wasn't going to let the shadows win. She turned back to the altar, her eyes scanning the glowing symbols. The power here wasn't just ancient. It was alive, waiting for her to wield it. She placed her hands flat on the altar, her voice firm as she spoke into the darkness. "You're not taking her. Not now. Not ever." The symbols flared brightly, blinding her for a moment. The warmth coursed through her again, stronger this time, and the air around her seemed to vibrate with energy. The shadows screamed, their forms writhing and twisting as the light from the altar grew stronger. But they didn't retreat. Instead, they surged forward, their desperation palpable. Mia's mind raced. She needed to act quickly, but the power of the altar was overwhelming. She closed her eyes, focusing on the life growing inside her, the tiny heartbeat that had given her the strength to keep fighting. And then, she knew what to do. She opened the journal, flipping to the last page. The words seemed to shimmer on the paper, and as she read them aloud, the symbols on the altar pulsed in response. "By the blood of the innocent, the breach shall close. By the will of the pure, the darkness shall fade." The altar's glow intensified, and the whispers turned into a deafening roar. Mia screamed as a surge of energy shot through her body, her vision going white. When the light faded, she was no longer in the chamber. She found herself standing in a vast, empty space, the ground beneath her feet smooth and featureless. In the distance, she saw a figure, a woman in a nurse's uniform, her expression calm and kind. "You did well," the nurse said, her voice gentle. "Is it over?" Mia asked, her voice trembling. "Not yet," the nurse replied. "You have one final choice to make." The nurse stepped aside, revealing two glowing doors behind her. One pulsed with a warm, golden light, while the other shimmered with an icy blue glow. "The golden door will seal the breach forever," the nurse explained. "But it will come at a cost. Your child's connection to this power will be severed, and she will live an ordinary life, safe, but unaware of her destiny." "And the blue door?" Mia asked. "The blue door will leave the breach open, but you and your child will gain the ability to protect this world from the darkness. It is a dangerous path, but one that could save countless lives." Mia's heart ached at the decision before her. The golden door meant safety, but at the expense of her child's extraordinary potential. The blue door meant a life of struggle and sacrifice, but with the chance to protect others from the horrors she had faced. She looked down at her belly, her hands cradling the life growing inside her. "What do you think?" she whispered, tears streaming down her face. A soft warmth spread through her, and she knew her answer. She stepped toward the blue door, her steps steady despite the fear gnawing at her heart. As she reached for the handle, the nurse's voice echoed one last time. "Be brave, Mia. You are not alone." Mia opened the door, and a blinding light engulfed her. Conclusion.